Good afternoon. How's everybody doing? I'm so glad that you chose to be here instead of the happy hours that are happening down there. But we saved one of the best ones for last. So thank you for joining. The session here that we're going to have the next hour is all around cybersecurity, threats, threat landscape, who is out there, what are the targets, and so on and so forth. The format is going to be, we're going to have two speakers give us some 10-minute sessions, then we're going to have a panel of experts come up here and talk a little bit more about that space. So looking forward to the discussion. And without further ado, well, actually, let me introduce myself. Sorry, my name is Ellen Boehm, and I work for a company called KeyFactor. We're a cybersecurity software company. We do public key infrastructure, which is we provide certificates and keys and key management, which is essentially digital identities for all sorts of things, whether it's in the enterprise network devices, or my world, which is IoT. So think about all of these new devices, whether it's connected vehicles or connected medical devices, energy infrastructure, all of these endpoints, which we don't want anyone to hack into, how do we secure those at the edge? So that's a little bit about what I do. But again, happy to be here with all these distinguished people. But now, without further ado, if I could please invite up to stage Bill Malik. So Bill comes to us from Trend Micro. He is the VP of Infrastructure Security. And he's going to give us a small talk about who and what the cyber crooks are doing these days. How do we kind of prioritize and understand the risks that are out there, and what proactive measures that we're going to take. Please join me in welcoming Bill.
Thank you very much. Now I can breathe. So yeah, I've got a few charts to talk about where the threats are. This is from one of our reports, Forward Threat Research. We also have the Zero-Day Initiative. And what we're looking at here are the dramatic increase in business email compromise and CEO fraud. The kinds of things that are happening in BEC are getting pretty grotty. I have a friend who's a senior executive at one of the big banks in New York. I won't tell you which one, but it starts with a C. And he said that he had an interesting problem where an assistant to a vice president got an email from a buddy of his. Their kids play together, and the email said, "Hey, Fred, it's Joe. I just wanted to congratulate you on your son's performance in the softball game last week. You really looked good. So, by the way, Fred, we've had this invoice outstanding, and it's getting close to the end of the quarter, and if you could just sort of, give your AP people a nudge, then it would help a lot." And so Fred goes, "Oh, gee, for Joe, of course." And so he forwards the email directly to accounts payable and says, "You guys really got to get on this. It's been outstanding for a long time." About 15 minutes later, he gets an email back from one of the AP supervisors, says, "The account number that they gave you isn't valid." So Fred calls up Joe and says, "Hey, Joe, I got your email, but the account number's no good." And Joe said, "What?" Because they had used LinkedIn Professional and they'd used Facebook, and they found out that Fred had a friend named Joe, and they both had kids who were in the same league. That's how significant this is getting, because if they had not mistyped the account, that's 10 megabucks gone, right? Towards the end of the quarter, and for this bank, you can probably lose that easily. Well, the point is these things are going bigger and bigger and better and better. So when you see big hacks and the data never shows up on the web, it's usually some nation state actor collecting the stuff. Think the Starwood, or sometimes called the Marriott breach, or the Yahoo breach from the early part of the last decade. That information never made it onto the internet. That's where it went. CEO fraud, same kind of thing. When it comes to who the target is, this kind of information isn't really helpful. It's not like you say, "Oh my God, it's hospitals. We should stop being a hospital. We should get into, grocery." No, the target is you. So don't sweat who's attacking ransomware. Assume you're going to be attacked, and take the kinds of measures. And this is the kind of risk prioritization I would recommend people take. Rather than try to quantify risk, first of all, there are things that are incommensurate. You can't measure this. And second of all, let me step onto my favorite soapbox. Frederick W. Taylor, the father of scientific management, never ever said, if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. which is a fortunate thing because it's not true. I have teenage daughters. I know what it means to manage things you can't measure. What Frederick Taylor did say was, if you measure it, then you will manage it. And that was a warning. Pick your metrics carefully. Use generally qualitative statements like this. If it's likely to happen and if it'll have a big problem, you should probably check it out. If it's rare and it's not going to cause a big problem, you can probably go on to something else. And in the area of IoT, here are the kinds of things you can look at. And these charts are available. You can certainly, ping me, wjmalik@knock.social. Yeah, problems happening. And using PKI to secure this, and now we've got chips that have the horsepower to be able to do those calculations relatively quickly. I heartily endorse what you're doing. I helped Entrust launch out of BNR quite some time ago. So yeah, I'm a big fan of what PKI can be. Here is an interesting one. Have you ever been on a road that was going to converge with another road? Since I've got the lights in me, I can't see her all jumping up and down. But the answer is yes, and how you can tell is that the other road's coming in alongside you. I would like to propose that there is no such thing as IT-OT convergence, that what we see is a growing divergence. And any vendor in this space who thinks their problems are going to be solved because this stuff is going to converge is dreaming, and they are leading their prospects and customers into a dark place. The first principle of IT is that data shall not be lost or altered or inadvertently disclosed. The first principle when you're doing OT is that it'll be safe, and even if it breaks, the underlying service should still be available. What does that mean? It means if you're on an escalator and it breaks, it locks in place. You can't use it as an escalator, but it's now safe to use as a stairway. IT people do not get that. That is a huge cultural divide. The typical targets for protection are relatively current versions. Support just dropped for Windows 12, right? Well, Server 12, and Linux current. But the typical thing, proprietary gear, legacy, I mean, for goodness sakes, Voyager 1 is 22 light hours away, and they were just able to fix it remotely, and they didn't do a service call, right? The point is those stuff lasts a long time. And in terms of communications, the proprietary protocols, conventional in OT environments, are slowly migrating to an IT base. There is, all sorts of things over IP, but fundamentally, divergence is the answer here. So think very carefully when somebody says, it's going to converge, problems are solved. Protective measures to prevent risk, these are the CIS controls, CIS controls. They will help you out of a problem. Just do the ones you can, the ones that are affordable. Zero trust, trend is behind the zero trust architecture. We believe that's very good. Here are some interesting things. Zero trust is not new. User and entity behavior analytics was invented in the 1990s. If a thing starts acting flaky, turn it off, shut it down. The idea of having regular, frequent checks to see if a service is still valid and functional, that's a really good idea. The idea that you validate a piece of equipment before it plugs into your network, that's a really good idea. That's called network access control. Also, it's been around since the 1990s. The idea that you don't rely on a perimeter, that's what the whole Jericho initiative was. Also, late 90s, early 2000s. Not new stuff, but important. Remember, write words in rote order. I promised I'd say something about James Joyce because I'm missing the class on reading the wake, which is going on as we speak. And this is a hat tip to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Because if you look at how an event starts out and then becomes observed and then becomes identified as adverse and then becomes a true incident and then eventually demands a response, how do you get from there to here? That's the attack framework, folks. Figure out the order in which things flow into your enterprise and cause trouble. And every one of those things that is skipped is called a process escape, and the solution is maturity. We spend so much time, if we have a problem, thinking about how our products could have saved us. People are the most important factor. Here's a simple test. I want you to imagine a colleague of yours walking down the hall and they see someone doing something online that might be wrong. I want you to ask her these three questions. First, would she know if it's wrong? Second, would she choose to report it? And third, if she picked up the phone, would she know who to call? In more formal IT security terms, is there a fundamental awareness of security? Is there a culture of security? And do you have the management mechanisms in place to support that culture? If the answers are yes, yes, and yes, you've won, and it doesn't matter what tools you're using, because your people will do the right thing. But if there's a no in there, I don't know if that's right or wrong. Or, yeah, it's wrong, but, I talked to my boss, and my boss said, well, they're not really in our area, and we don't want to ruffle feathers, right? Or you say, slam, slang it, I'm going to report it, and you pick up the phone and call security, say, I want to report a security problem, and they put you in touch with a fire department. If you have a no in there, you've lost. And again, it doesn't matter what technology you've got. Get the people right, make sure the processes are durable, let the technology take care of itself. Here's some references that'll help. Thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you, Bill. All right, and so for our second 10-minute speaker, I would like to welcome up to the stage Chris Novak. So Chris comes to us from Verizon. He is the managing director of Verizon Cybersecurity Consulting. And some of the things I think he's going to cover are the cyber threat landscape. Also, many of you have probably heard about the data breach investigation report. Very valuable information and research in there. So Chris, please take it away.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody today. And actually, Bill, I love the anecdotes that you shared. I've seen a lot of those in my time. A lot of what my team does is around incident response, threat intelligence. You mentioned the DBIR. You see the cover. Oh, you don't see the cover? You see the cover now. And a lot of the work that we do goes into the report that we've produced now for the last 16 years. And it's always kind of interesting to see how these things evolve over time in terms of the types of incidents we see, how they manifest. The example that Bill gave in terms of knowing who to call and what to do. One of the early breaches that I was involved with investigating, and to be clear, I know a lot of people know Verizon as a telco. The area of my shop is actually kind of I'd say it was an acquisition that happened many years ago. And we do breach investigations and cybersecurity consulting and managed security for organizations, whether they're on or not on our network. But going back to that kind of initial anecdote, it was an early breach where nobody really knew what to do or who to call. And when they realized what was happening, we had asked them, do you have people that you'll call in? And like, oh yeah, no problem, we know who to call. And then all of a sudden there's a big bang on the door, and it was the SWAT team. And it's like, okay, clearly we have to work on the who do you call, because the threat actors, the hackers, they're not actually in the building. We need to go find them elsewhere. This was about 20 years ago. So in terms of the data that we probably have more data on incidents and breaches than anyone else in the world. I mentioned that we do the DBIR, and it's something we've put together now for the last 16 years. And over that time, it's not just been about the data that we amass from the investigations that our team works around the world, but also we've brought on other data contributors. So there's data from all different other incident response firms, CERTs, ISACs, government agencies, the FBI, the US Secret Service. They've all been contributors to the data and the report as well. And so we anonymize, aggregate that data, bring it all together, and try to figure out what all has actually occurred. Kind of the who, what, how, why. And then the fundamental aspect of it is, how do we draw conclusions from it that can help us all be better? Because in the early days of when we put this together, nobody talked about breaches. In fact, there were times where we would actually talk to potential contributors to the report, government organizations, and they'd say, sorry, we can't contribute. There's no breaches that happen here. And so you can see how things have manifested over time. It's now become a topic that we can talk about. It now is in the news even more. And when I actually came to MWC, it was kind of funny. I told people I was coming to Vegas, and everyone's like, oh, we know why you're going to Vegas. And I'm like, no, it's not that reason. I'm actually going to a conference. So it was kind of funny to see how that materialized. And obviously, there's a lot of big numbers on here. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this. If you've not had an opportunity to read the report, it goes into much greater detail on what all of the numbers mean. For the sake of brevity, I'm giving you kind of the Cliff Notes version. There's also a lot here I'm going to distill down into a couple of key points and kind of takeaways from the research. One is in terms of who we see is often behind a lot of these, and all of this available to you guys. Who we see behind all these events, typically we see it as external. We see about 20% or so is insiders, and that could be malicious insiders or accidental. But then the large majority of what we see is external. And a lot of times it is for financial gain. They are attacking an organization because they believe that organization has something of value that they can steal and ultimately sell and monetize. And so that's where things like business email compromises, Bill gave some great examples of. Also, we see a lot of ransomware attacks because these events typically are monetized very fast. It's not like other forms of data breaches where we hear, 100 million records of sensitive information were stolen, but keep in mind that that's stealing a lot of data, but they don't make any money until they can find a market to sell it and a buyer to buy it. And then they do a transaction, and now they've monetized that event. Ransomware has been in the news a lot, but interestingly, one of the things we've noticed about it is over the course of the last year, it's actually plateaued. It actually kind of hit a high watermark of about 24%. Now, that's good and bad. The reason why I say it's good is that it's not still skyrocketing. In years prior, we saw exponential increases in this. So obviously that was very concerning as to where that trend would go. So the fact that it leveled off, I think is a great thing. But I'm not really gonna celebrate until we start to see it really start to decline and kind of move back down. But I think the fact that we've put other defenses in place, we're starting to see that play out. We're starting to see that be effective and actually work. The other thing also I'll mention is social engineering and the role of the human factor. And I think Bill touched on this as well. We see in the data across all of the breaches in the report, 74% relate back to the human element. So that is either someone intentionally or accidentally did something somewhere that was causal or contributory in some significant way to that breach occurring. And that, I think, is absolutely tremendous. I'll share with you a quick story of a phishing attack, and this goes to, you'll see in a moment, kind of the user education piece. So this individual received the phishing email, and it said, hey, go in, there's an amazing discount for all employees, click here. It's only for the first, 100 people who click on it. I don't remember what the actual number was. And someone goes and clicks on it. It was obviously a phishing link, but they didn't realize it. And it turns out the link didn't work. The site was identified by security. They had made all the right calls, and they got the site shut down. So she got an error message, and she couldn't actually proceed. But then she went and replied to the email and said, hey, I'm trying to get the discount, but the link's not working. To which the threat actor said, oh, here's a new one. This one should work. Clicked on it, and what do you know, it worked. So there's, and these are maybe a little bit more cheeky, funny stories that are not all that, they don't all happen like that. But there's a lot, I think, that can go on in terms of education and awareness around the user base. It happens to everybody. All organizations face these kinds of challenges. And so, again, there's more that we can do there. And then I'll kind of step through a handful of recommendations. For me, it's always big to talk about cyber hygiene. It's probably one of the least sexy parts of cybersecurity, but one of the most fundamental, because a lot of times, a lot of the issues that trip organizations up are some of the really basic things, because usually people just don't want to do them. They're not fun, they're not exciting, they don't necessarily involve the most leading edge, bleeding edge technology. I see asset inventory, I always have that on my list, because if you don't know what assets you have, how do you secure them? How do you monitor them? How do you do anything with them? I see many breaches that my team investigates where one of the biggest issues was the hacker got into some part of their environment or some systems that they just weren't even tracking. They didn't even know they exist. And this isn't onesie twosies. It's not uncommon for us to get into an environment. We do our own discovery when we get there, and we may find tens of thousands of assets that they're not tracking. And that may sound like an absurd number. For a large organization, it's really not. And if it's an organization that's gone through a lot of mergers and acquisitions, divestitures, we'll find entire data centers where there are systems that aren't even supposed to be there. They were supposed to go to the divested organization, but nobody knew what was what, so it all just remained. And so it stayed active, and it kind of became this kind of hacker's playground of where they could get into and exploit. Password management is another critical thing. We see a lot of issues where passwords are reused over and over again. Everybody kind of knows the usual mechanism for logins are an email and a password. So if you use that same password anywhere, it's trivially easy for the threat actors to be able to just bombard the internet with that login credential and try to get into different places. Establishing an ecosystem of cybersecurity partners. I usually ask everybody, do you have enough cybersecurity people in your organization? Do you need more? Everyone always says, yes, I need more, I can't find them. And so this is a challenge. And what I always encourage organizations to do is try to find other external partners to work with, to be your backup, to be your sounding board, to engage with, to have, if it's a commercial relationship, have contracts ironed out, terms and conditions in place, because you don't know what needs you're going to need until you need them. You don't know how big the scope is going to be. You want to have all that stuff kind of ironed out, ready to go before the need arises. Executive breach simulations, this is actually something we saw took off during the course of the pandemic. We had just an insane amount of requests for these. And these are different than your traditional kind of tabletop exercises, where organizations might say, let's go through the motions of what we would do if this kind of breach happened. That's more at the technical level. This is much more at the C-level or the board level to say, okay, if the bad day happens, something like what happened in Vegas, do our executives all know what buttons we're going to push, what actions we're going to take, and are we all on the same page? Because I'll tell you, when there's not an incident actively happening, everybody says they know what they're going to do, and it's all going to be fine. Then they get into the incident, and they're in the war room, and someone says, well, let's just shut down all the slot machines. Let's just lock all the rooms. Let's close all the stores. This is easy. Until someone else goes, do you realize how much money we lose per second, per minute, per day, per week? If we do that, we're not doing that. And so all of a sudden you have a lot of infighting at the time where you least need it. So these executive breach simulations really kind of help with that. Integrated threat intelligence, this is another key piece, and I say integrated on purpose because I see a lot of organizations have intel, but they don't have it worked into their apparatus. And so as a result, it's more just kind of like having encyclopedias on the shelf. When something happens after it's already happened, you pull the book off the shelf and you read about what just happened to you. But what if you could use it more proactively and say, how do we use it to stop these bad things from happening? Kind of almost a little bit of a dovetail off of what Bill mentioned around metrics. We actually released all the metrics that we use to create our DBIR as open source. It's on verisframework.org. So if anyone's interested in looking at how we make the DBIR or want to make your own, it's all there for you to download and play with as you see fit. We also do a monthly intelligence briefing. So the DBIR is an annual report, but we kind of keep that motion alive, that momentum going with monthly intelligence briefings that are free for you all to attend and kind of see what it is that we're seeing now, how things might be changing between the big publications and what's going on in the landscape. And I think that is all I have. And the link for the DBIR as well, for anybody who has not had an opportunity to read it, feel free to download it and enjoy. If you have any questions, I'm always happy to chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. All right, I'd like to invite our panelists to come up here on the stage, please. Take a seat, and we'll go one by one and introduce you. Okay, wonderful. All right, so thank you, panelists, for joining. So I'm going to start all the way down at the end. We have Jason Boswell, who is the head of end-to-end security at Ericsson. Welcome.
Hello.
Next, we have Michaela Vanderveen. She is the fight lead at MITRE. Welcome. Glad to have you. Next, we have Therese Stowell, who is the VP of Product Management at Onfido.
Hi.
Welcome. And lastly, we have Richard Sulz, who is Security and Risk Management Analyst at WithSecure. Wonderful. All right, so we've got about 30 minutes here. We've got some questions. I'm going to address the questions to one panelist, but again, feel free to kind of join in. Let's have a great dialogue here. So kind of building off what we just heard from the previous two speakers, I'd like to start with a kind of a general question. And we're going to go down the path of when it comes to attackers and threats and all of that, it's the why, it's the who, and it's the how. So this first question I'm going to address to Jason. So talk to us a little bit about the motives that we're seeing when it comes to why our infrastructure or why our systems are being attacked.
All right.
So what do you think?
Well, looking at Chris's report he just put up there is 90 plus percentile, it's money, right? That's the main motivating factor. But what's interesting, like if you look at what he said about sometimes the monetization part happens much later. So in some ways that becomes a different kind of attack. What's actually being taken is information. So yeah, it's money as the first motivator, and that would probably likely be like ransomware, things that can be more immediately monetized. Then it's information is the other motive. Now sometimes that turns into a monetizable act. Sometimes maybe it's a nation state actor and the information has a different reason for being taken. And then the last one is disruption. Service disruption or inavailability of the service is sometimes either the key motivating factor, or maybe it's an ancillary byproduct. It could even be that the initial motivation was, I'm going to get in there and my target is this, and I'm going to put crypto lockers in, and I'm going to steal data where I can, and it's money that's motivating. But something happens along the way, and that's not working out, and it becomes obvious that maybe my attack isn't going to be fulfilled, so it's time to burn it down on my way out the door, right? And burn some of my tracks going out. So what ends up happening then is service disruption. So we think of it in these terms of what's the mitigations that I can take depending on what that motivating factor is, right? If I'm trying to prevent ransomware, then there's key things that I do. Maybe it's data fragmentation, so that if you do get some of that data, you're not really going to do anything with it. But is that really going to help if the key motivation is just to make your service disrupted? Not really, right? So how can you build in cyber resilience? And that gets into some of what we're going to continue to talk about in the what do you do next part.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Anyone like to add to this?
Yes, we'd like to add, for instance, the fact that part of the information about users and people, like their location, that is a high-value target often. We see at least in the telecom world.
Mm-hmm. And I would just add that even as recently as today, we saw release of information about an APT that is basically attacking edge hardware, attacking switches, routers, basically putting in something that they can come back to later using what's known as a magic packet. So there's a lot of, and I would just add that Verizon does a great job of creating that report, but it's coming from a company that's dealing with the monetary aspect of this. And when you're looking at it from a more pure research aspect, you may see that there are other reasons to attack, like basically just gaining hold of an asset that you could then move laterally to another one or use to attack or compromise somebody else, your ultimate target, for instance. So I would be cautionary with that 95%.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of these unreported attacks are more nation-state related and therefore are really attacking for reasons that make money kind of an ancillary, just like kind of a bonus,
Yeah. Since it's Vegas, maybe they just want that chip, and they're going to cash that chip in later.
Yep.
It could be for any one of those three things. They want to cash it in for money. No, maybe they just want to cash it in for the intel they can gain from it. Or, hey, this exploit that I'm planting now, the other things haven't worked out, I'm going to burn it down later. You never know.
Yeah.
I would also add, so organized crime is behind quite a lot of the fraud attacks that we see. Money laundering is another related motive. It's how they hide their money.
Yeah, great point. So we've kind of shifted a little bit and starting to talk about who these actors are, right? And that's a great point that you bring there. So maybe Richard, if I could have you kind of expand a little bit more. Who are these actors? What are these organizations we're up against? If they are organizations, obviously very intelligent groups. But from your perspective, what are you seeing being like the top few?
Sure, thank you. From a research perspective, I mean, the most powerful actors, threat actors, are APTs. And typically APTs, or by definition APTs, are not the actors, but the act itself. But we've kind of blurred the lines between those. So for instance, you might be familiar with Cozy Bear, or my favorite example, the Equation Group, which is most likely we know to be an NSA-based actor. But these most competent of threat actors are going to be nation-state sponsored or organized crime sponsored, or probably, honestly, in some cases, blurring the lines between both when it comes to nation-states and organizations that we consider to be our enemies across the ocean, so to speak.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
In particular, where it's like hacking as a service, right? So they could be just doing it on their own from money motivation, but they could also make that service available to a threat agency, a foreign threat agency, let's say.
We see, we see fraud rings that are essentially shadow businesses. So they have R&D, they innovate, they have a roadmap, they look at ROI, and they're always kind of, they're using the same technology that is available to us, and so it's kind of a constant arms race. But they really are a business.
Ransomware, a respectable business is what I'm hearing. You pay them, they will decrypt your stuff for a fee, and it's respectable to hold on to. They will deliver.
Honor among thieves.
They are exactly honor amongst thieves.
Speaking of ransomware, I have to say that, again, as a researcher and consultant, I have seen ransomware go down, as was mentioned previously in this past year, but I've seen it not just disappear in terms of the vacuum that's left, I've seen that specifically filled with exfiltration. So rather than trying to make money on just ransoming your data, they're taking it now, these threat actors, they're taking as much data as they can, they're exfiltrating it, and then they're either threatening the organization with it, with exposure of it, or sale of it. And so I feel like that's very important to mention because it's misleading just to say that ransomware has plateaued.
So interesting. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit more about the targets. And Michaela, I'd like to have you maybe comment on this. It seems like every organization could be a target, whether it's really small or whether it's large. But what are the sort of categories of targets that you're seeing, and what's the perspective on that?
So we see large companies being targeted for their information, government contractors who work on defense projects, also smaller companies, and in fact, no one is safe. I heard that even establishments that do social work for the disabled, they got hacked. And at some point, somebody was they were looking to hack into the water plant, and they saw pressure gauge. Turns out they actually hacked into a car wash. So even a car wash is not safe.
Wow.
So really the whole gamut for various reasons.
Yeah, got it.
I mean, obviously the target are the high value ones where you as a threat actor or a group can then do damage or monetize that. But in order to get to those targets, sometimes you can start with the very smallest of organizations, and that's why no organization is bulletproof in that sense. Because you might just be a contractor for a large teleco, and you may have 10 employees, but you may also have a hook into that teleco's network.
Yep, it's the weakest link right there. And I think, Therese, we talked a little bit about this earlier from a services perspective. So how do you have proper authentication and access control and to these critical systems? So maybe some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was kind of going back to what was said before. I was thinking about a couple really impactful hacks where somebody used a SIM swap. So a SIM swap is where it's social engineering where you get somebody within the telco to change the SIM, and then that completely defeats like multi-factor authentication. And so Jack Dorsey's Twitter account got hacked, and this group was able to impersonate him and tweet for about 15 minutes. And if you think about that could have a political motivation, that could have a financial implication if you short stock, or there's just a bunch of different ways that has benefit. And then there was another case where there's a crypto investor in the US, and he got hacked in the same way, and he lost $24 million in crypto.
So as a PSA, don't rely on two-factor authentication as text. use
Absolutely.
authentication.
Yeah. I mean, what we do, and I'm not trying to sell our product, but we use biometric and AI to do document verification, and that's a much more effective way of gating access to services. But really, like, as we were talking about, the fraudsters are getting kind of consistently innovating, and the best thing is to have sort of a really layered approach. And you have to look at the social engineering side as much as the kind of systems tech side.
Yeah, I think this is maybe a good shift into the what can we do phase. We've had a lot of conversation around what can happen and why, but maybe some recommendations about what can people do to prevent this or be more aware, or what are best practices here?
I think the folks who spoke earlier, like, nailed it. I mean, I think,
Bill had some great suggestions.
Yeah.
The zero trust model, really.
Okay, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So I mean, effectively creating layers of responsibility and trust, essentially trying to remove any kind of access that shouldn't be available to an individual. Understanding, quite frankly, categorizing and understanding asset risk. You know, Bill again made an excellent point. I'm sorry if it was Chris. There was an excellent point made, essentially, that a lot of organizations don't completely understand the assets or have a map or an inventory of all of their assets. I see that all the time, especially with like new CISOs coming in. So by essentially removing access to everything other than what the employee or individual needs, that's part of that zero trust model, just effectively collapsing down all of your rights to just that which you need to do your job.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Well, other thoughts from the group?
One thing would be to empower the defenders. For instance, threat frameworks. Thank you, Bill, for the MITRE ATT&CK plug. The threat frameworks like MITRE ATT&CK, and now we're working on, I'm a project lead for a FIGHT, which is 5G threat framework based on MITRE ATT&CK. So these are, I would say, contribute to such threat frameworks, because they are the ones that feed the tools that the defenders use to defend their networks. And it's very important to collaborate, to be open about the threats that they see. And this is how it grows. And you know, what you saw, for instance, a telecom operator, there's more of a culture of sharing in Europe because they're so interconnected and so many more operators. And there's a lot of roaming going around. And so they have a culture of sharing, because if it happened to me, it may happen to my roaming partner.
Exactly, that's very true. I can attest to that from an Ericsson standpoint. It's definitely a cultural mindset on, because you are roaming partners, and even not just roaming, but like there's network sharing, there's spectrum sharing. It's just a different model than the US, which is typically very siloed. Here's my very large business next to your very large business, and if your building's on fire, it probably doesn't affect me, right? So it's a different mindset. But if we think about like a thought exercise here, why is the fight and attack framework so effective? What makes it so effective? It's because it is built on thinking like an attacker, right? It's not thinking of how do I defend. It's thinking, well, how would I attack this? What would I do? I would go through these steps. Okay, great. That's the best place to start from. So think about your network, your enterprise, whatever it is, in the same way you would think about your house, right? How do you protect your home? How do you protect your family, the environment inside, right? That's typically a wall and moat type approach is how it's often presented, but that's not really true, right? It's really, there's a lot of access points in different ways into the home that on the face value may not feel like to the homeowner, oh, this is something I need to protect. Because what do they mainly focus on? I need a better lock. I need a bigger front door, right? I need a safe inside. I'm going to put all my valuable things there. But what attackers look at, like say the home, is there high value inside? Are there lights on? I mean, somebody's paying attention. If all the lights are off, nobody's home, nobody's paying attention, right? So think of your network that way. Are you monitoring things? Does it get reported on frequently? What if I just probe? If I just probe and I hit your network with a whole bunch of junk, what do you do with it? Do you shut it down quickly? If you don't, I know you're not paying attention, okay? That's something I want to pay attention to. How many windows do you have on your home? How many are on the first floor? So don't forget about the front door. The front door is really hard to get in through. So is the firewall at the edge of your network. But you know it's a lot easier to get into through the network? Maybe a cloud-based API that you forgot about, that you stood up a long time ago. That's the window on the ground floor. If you've got, I think my house like 12 windows on the ground floor, and oh my gosh, like just to secure all these different windows, that's a lot easier way to get into a house than the front door, right? You think about the small business that you mentioned, that seems like maybe that's not a target. Do you lock your car when it's in the driveway? I know in some neighborhoods you do, some neighborhoods you don't. I don't always lock my car, but what does my car have? A garage door opener.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, it's the easiest way to get into a house. Just look for an unlocked vehicle and open the garage door and walk right in, right? That's the entryway through a small business that you probably forgot about. Do they have a garage door opener into your network? I guarantee you're all going to go home and lock your cars now.
Yes.
Yeah, and small businesses are not empowered. We don't look at security as having value to an organization, right? We do because we're security professionals, but the average organization doesn't. It's kind of like the way IT was looked at in the early 2000s. You're part of the janitorial staff. We just know that we need you to run. We don't really know anything else about you. But the reality is that security needs to be empowered because someone is going to sneak in through that garage door. Someone's going to sneak into Verizon or Ericsson or T-Mobile through a remote site that has been forgotten about, or through a small vendor that's not noticed that has, again, a hook into that network. Nobody's going in through the front door.
Right.
The front door is secured like Fort Knox. It's the pieces we've forgotten about. Sorry.
But you make a really good point about monitoring. So there's the moat and locking the door and everything, but then there's also keeping an eye on the windows, whether it's an alarm system or a security guard or that sort of thing. And the more you can kind of figure out what's the data, what are the signals that can tell you that there is somebody trying to break into your system. And so if you can put those in place, then one, you can respond more quickly, but you can also that helps you understand where you are vulnerable. And it enables you to have a layered approach.
And if you've ever had an incident, or if you haven't, logging. Make sure that you log, please. Verbose logging is very important.
Yep.
If you want to know how an incident started, verbose logging.
And if you think you haven't had an incident, you're wrong.
Or if you think you're never going to have one, it's bound to happen at some point, right?
And then secure those logs so that they cannot be changed and the trace erased and so forth.
Yeah, there's a reason Splunk was just purchased for $38 million.
Yeah.
Some
A lot of
insane
money.
amount.
Very true. Yeah.
All right, great tips. So I heard a couple of you kind of talking about this and the earlier presenters as well, about an ecosystem of cybersecurity partners or companies. So in your experience, how have you seen that evolve over the years, and how are people collaborating in this space? I mean, obviously we're here talking about telecom and this specific vertical, but a lot of what we do, I think, goes across or can go across multiple industries. How are we in the cybersecurity space evolving the way that we address some of these challenges collaboratively?
Well, as an employee of a cybersecurity consulting firm, and having been in this field for decades, I have to say that it's really refreshing to see collaboration finally occurring amongst cybersecurity professionals. It used to be that the average cybersecurity person was a hacker with a sweatshirt in a dark room, and thankfully, that stereotype has largely been busted at this point, and you get to actually see professionals from various organizations collaborating on independent Slack channels, hopefully not too much on Discord because it's horribly insecure. But we never had things like the MITRE framework in the in the 90s.
In the 90s,
it just didn't exist.
Yeah.
So a great call out, by the way. MITRE is fantastic. I use it all the time, both in defensive and offensive consulting. But it's just wonderful to actually see a lot of this stuff coming to the light so that we can share it. I know there's a contesting, a feeling potentially on this, but I'm personally very much in favor of the new rules that are coming out of the SEC, New York DFS, that are requiring reporting of breaches in a much more timely manner, or perhaps, in the event of some cases, not at all in the past. And now we actually have to understand how these ransomware attacks or attacks in general are occurring, when they're occurring. And a lot of these regulations are just kind of being tested. Their amendments are out there for response. But I'm really enthused and excited about the next couple of years because we're going to get to see a lot more real data as researchers about these things. So I'm really excited about all of this knowledge sharing. You can be sure that the bad guys are sharing knowledge to some degree or another. They're not sharing their tactics with each other, of course. They're not sharing the golden way of attacking a network for this group, for Fancy Bear, But they're definitely going to share what works in a general sense, and we should be too.
That's a great point.
Yeah, if you think about fraud rings, there are known fraudsters, and they're just going across all the high-value targets, especially in the financial industry. And we have talked about trying to build kind of a known fraudster database and sharing data across different businesses. There are challenges from a regulatory perspective. So regulation and legislation is moving toward, really privileging individual privacy. And so it's quite challenging. I mean, there are solutions around I'm so hard to say this word. Whatever. The hashing, tokenization, kind of data storage policies, and things like that. But you can also really fall afoul. And so if you look at things like BIPA in Illinois, you can leave yourself vulnerable to lawsuits. So it's challenging, but it's so clearly, like, there's so many benefits to sharing data and making sure that we're all kind of joined up in fighting fraud.
Yes, so one very interesting collaboration between two different industries, the financial industry and the telecom industry. So the operators usually don't share a whole lot outside their networks, but they somehow feel responsible about all this bank fraud going on using the cellular communication. So what happened is that they felt so responsible, and so they decided that they're going to open an API to the banks so that whenever the bank sees something suspicious, like there is a transfer being requested, they do make just one API call to the telco saying, is there a call in progress? And if the answer is yes, the chance that it's fraud is much higher, so then they put a stop to it. That was really nice to see that happening.
That's actually so in parts of Europe, they do that for SIM swaps. So there's an API that the bank can call, and they will stop if there's been a SIM swap in the last few days. The US is a little bit behind, so if you all are listening, there's an opportunity to stop fraud there. Great.
Yep. It's something I was trying to think about from a partner and an ecosystem perspective, but I actually think about it like from a business perspective. There's less and less of an excuse for poor security. There's less of an excuse than there has ever been. And you could argue that even as recently as 5 years ago, you could make excuses if you were a small business, or even if you're a large business, let's say, and what you're trying to implement is an inline hardware-based platform. And the classic excuse was, it will affect performance. I can't put in an IPS, I can't put in a firewall, I can't put in an identity management system because it's inline and I pass so much traffic, it will either affect performance or it will bankrupt me, right? But I'll be secure. Those excuses aren't legitimate anymore, right? It's software-based, it's API-driven, it's AI-enhanced to know when to turn on, when to turn it down somewhat, like something might be happening, let's crank this up to verbose. You can do all these things in a very automated and intelligent fashion now. So I do think that government is kind of picking up on this as well, like you mentioned, like some of the different initiatives around a regulatory framework to encourage businesses to incorporate these security practices because there's less and less of a reason not to.
Great point. All right, well, we've covered a lot of topics, and looking at the clock here, I want to give each of you like 1 minute to kind of leave the audience with a couple points that you want them to remember. And so we'll start down here. So Richard?
Okay. I guess I would say that, security, IT security, cybersecurity is here to stay. The companies that will thrive are the ones that invest in it, that try and get ahead of it. I mentioned, these regulations that we kind of briefly touched on. We've been doing a deep dive on how those affect organizations, especially at the middle level organizations. And those organizations that are on top of these regulations and kind of already doing these things or preparing to do them are going to be the ones that succeed. These crisis management simulations, tabletops, things that were mentioned by the previous speakers. And no organization is really too small to do this. It can scale very easily, especially if you start an organization with, say, a zero trust model. It's a lot easier to start in that way than it is to shoehorn it into an existing one from years past. And I have conducted IR investigations, so please do keep your verbose logs. I really mean that. And that's about it. I'm happy to chat with anybody who's interested. I am one of those consultants that, in the cybersecurity pack of consultants that you might want to, or organizations that you might want to have on hand. So, happy to chat with anybody who's having those kinds of issues or who might need to understand what the roadmap might be going forward.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, Therese?
Yeah, I would just think about fraudsters as professionals, and they're constantly innovating. They have the same tech as you, and so just using a layered approach across both the social engineering side and the sort of tech solution side. They're looking to, maximize impact for the minimum effort. And so if you put in place, a bunch of different hurdles that they have to get across, then they'll probably go to the next person. So do the work.
And I'd say do not assume you're secure just because, and then whatever your reason is. Have a plan of resilience, a plan of recovery already in place, so you know what to do when the breach does happen. And please do contribute to threat frameworks, public threat frameworks, for the good of everyone.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. If you're looking at kind of like what's next for your organization in security, remember an old term of AAA, but not AAA in the security context of authentication and authorization and accounting. Think of it in terms of what should you seek out for that next wave of technology. Is it actionable? So if there's threat intelligence that's generated, if you're putting something in, is it actually actionable that you can then turn around and do something with it? If it is actionable, that means you can automate it. So that's your next step. Is it conducive to an automation platform? Can I incorporate it into one I already have or build it from scratch? Splunk is great with this as an example, right? So now it's actionable, it's automated. If I can do those two things, that means I can enhance it with AI. So actionable and automation and AI, that's the 3 A's to take away. And we've heard AI a million times at this conference just in the past 2 days, because it's here to stay, and that's the next wave of how you enhance your intelligence.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much. I think I definitely learned a lot. Hopefully everyone did as well. A lot of tips and things to take away. Thank you very much for the panelists and as well for the speakers earlier. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the conference.
Thank you for hanging at the end of the day with us.